back to my channel. Today I am doing my, what am I doing? I am doing my reading wrap up for the month of January. I have some notes this time, so happy medium between my last two videos. So in the month of January, I read 15 books with 1 DNF, and 8 of them were from my library. So I actually did a pretty good job of reading some of the physical books that I have. My TBR shelf has expanded. It no longer fits on my one little shelf, so now I need to have my stack of nonfiction and my stack of fiction TBR. So, anyway, cool. Alright, so book number 1 was The Goblin Emperor by Katherine Addison. This was a book I picked up from a little free library in my neighborhood. I didn't know anything about it, and since picking it up, I feel like I've heard some people reference this, so it is not an unknown random book. I picked it up just because I thought, oh, I don't really see a lot of goblin protagonists in fantasy. Interesting. That was the entire reason I picked it up. Also, free books. Great. So this was a delightful surprise. It's a very engaging political court drama with some really stark racial themes that play out between the elves that are, you know, when you're a pureblood elf, you have pure white skin and hair, and then if you are a pureblood goblin, you are black hair, black, like dark, like ink black skin, and then everyone else are varying shades of white and gray in between. And this follows Maya, who is like the fourth son, half goblin emperor of the Elven Emperor, and then the Emperor, and all of his, like everyone ahead of him, everyone ahead of Maya in line for the throne gets killed, so Maya has to assume the throne. He was kind of living in exile. He never really expected to be able to rule. Like, he was going to be lucky to just not be assassinated by his father, who didn't really like him for various reasons that we get into. Wake up, computer. You have my notes. And yeah, I'm not someone who has read a lot of court dramas, but I feel like this has set the bar very high in terms of what I'm going to be looking for in those kinds of books. I'm going to put this down now. So it's very easy to root for our protagonist. Even though hasn't really been raised with the expectation of being able to rule, he is someone who has a really good moral compass, and we know he's going to make a good ruler if he can just survive this really messy transition period. I thought about this while I was reading this, like, if you are a fan of the wit and weaponry of social etiquette, like what you find in like Oscar Wilde and Jane Austen, then this might appeal to you, even though it's a really dense fantasy world. So this was great. Apparently there was a sequel for it that I'm going to keep my eye out for, maybe from my library. This was a good time. Book number 2 was Grave Peril by Jim Butcher. This is the 3rd book in the Dresden Files series that I am slowly rereading. I borrowed this from my library. Of like the 3 at the start of the series, it's the most lackluster one so far, in my opinion. The author is starting to experiment a little bit with the formula, which is fine. I just didn't really think it worked out. The pacing really suffered. Like, there would be a lot of build-up to these really intense battle scenes that would feel like a finale, but we're only like 40% through the book. And then everything would kind of just fall a lot. So it wasn't just like a steady build-up. It was like a build-up and a drop, and a build-up and a drop. And it was exhausting. The character Karen wasn't as present, which is a bummer, because she's great. I know she comes back more in the series, so I know it's just the author experimenting with new characters and a different formula. A thing I like about this world is the really strong magic rules, where, you know, we have a good understanding of like what magic can and can't do. There's a really interesting bit about the threshold of a home having power. So like the idea of like a vampire not being able to enter your home. It's not that they can't, it's that if they come in uninvited, they lose some of their power because a threshold has power. But that varies depending on the quality of the home. So, you know, Harry Dresden's messy bachelor pad has a much weaker threshold than his companion who has, you know, a wife and children and has really built a family. And home is really home, not just a place where you sleep and shower. So it was fine. It was fun. It's a fun urban fantasy action world where magic is cool. And having read like the first 12 books in the series or so, I know that I enjoy it. I know I'm going to keep going with it and just keep borrowing it from my library. So, yay. Book number 3 is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. So this was a book that I read a physical copy of. I had found it in a free library, and it had a little stamp in it. Actually, you see this book in my last video, which is like a bookshelf declutter. I have since gotten rid of it because I was trying to declutter some stuff, and this was a book that I knew I was going to return to the little free libraries in my neighborhood. So I liked it, but I didn't like it enough to keep it, and I don't know if I'm going to continue with the series. It's much darker than I expected. There was a lot of themes about, you know, given that the protagonist's grandfather was a refugee from World War II, there's a lot of those themes in there. There's definitely parallels between the Nazis as monsters hunting the Jews and other marginalized groups, and then also the people who are hunting the children with these peculiar gifts. The time loop mechanism in here is really clever. It's this kind of like the children are protected in a magical bubble of time. So they kind of have to relive the same day over and over again, but it protects them from being found. I like time travel and time mechanics in books, and I thought this one was interesting and clever. Not as much of a focus on Miss Peregrine as I would have expected. Maybe there's more in the later books, but it's a lot more about the protagonist discovering his grandfather's history and then discovering his own relevance to these events. The romance was icky, and it was exacerbated by the fact that the author/protagonist literally explains what's weird about this relationship and why it shouldn't happen, and then it proceeds to happen anyway. Well, I do not understand that choice. It was definitely one of the things that turned me off of the book. Book number 4 was Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. This was an audiobook I borrowed from my library. So this was something I read on audiobook, and I think it's narrated by the author. This was good. I liked it. This is something I would keep my eye out for a physical copy of. There's some really kind of specific takeaways about being Black, being a person of color, being, you know, someone living in poverty, and how those specifically impact the choices that you are able to make. So it's a book a lot about how feminism needs to be intersectional, and makes the argument why the case that a choice between crime and starvation is not a choice. So who the fuck do we think we are, judging people who do not have good choices? And that was another thing that was hammered in a chapter about being Black and poor and a parent, and the quote about having to make hard choices without good choices. When we judge people that we don't really understand their situation, like, we can't just judge the choices they make. We have to take into consideration the choices that are and are not available to them. Probably like my last big takeaway in terms of the you know, what is threatening about gentrification in a neighborhood is this line of housing is not just the concern of young women wanting to find a home or start a business, but also older women who need to age in place with dignity. And it's not just the prohibitive cost of retirement homes, but the impact of a gentrified neighbors, where the neighbors no longer know the elderly who are left behind, and there's no one left to check on them. And that is, you know, something I think about as an only child, thinking about my parents, where, you know, I've made the comment of like, you know, I don't necessarily need you to move into a retirement home where they cook all your meals and do all your shit, but please move in somewhere without stairs and where somebody will notice if you don't check your mail in 3 days. Theoretically, that should be me, but like, unless we live together, like, I'm not gonna go visit them every single day until they need that care. But sometimes it's hard to know when they've crossed into that point. Anyway, so yeah, that was something to think about in terms of, you know, gentrification is not just about like the pricing out of the people who have lived there for generations, but how does the neighborhood change in terms of neighbors who know each other and are responsible for each other and take care of each other. So yeah, that was a really interesting conversation to listen to. Book number 5 is The Seventh Tower, which is the first book in the series The Fall by Garth Nix. This is a middle grade fantasy series. This was one of my reread to declutter because I knew I had the series. I knew I'd read it. I couldn't remember anything about it. So with this being a middle grade book, I feel like it suffered a little bit in the middle grade simplicity. I found it really frustrating to read about the adults being absolutely awful and cruel and manipulative to this boy, and there wasn't in the first book. They do address this in the second book, but in the first book, there's really no musing at all on why they're doing this and what they stand to gain from it, so you're kind of just seeing this awful behavior in a vacuum without kind of anything to latch onto for why this is necessary in the storytelling. Like, we can kind of infer that it has something to do with his father, but like, I feel like if that had been a little bit more developed, it wouldn't have just been so stressful to read through. I'm also really sensitive to adults being awful to children in books, because fuck that. Totally forgot to show you that I had a physical copy of this. And also, I don't know if you can really see it, but you see, so this is like the tower. Can you see this little thing? I'm pretty sure this is like an image taken from a carving from a Mayan temple. I'll show you again. It's kind of, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but I can see little carving details on it, and having been to some of those temples, I'm like, yeah, I've taken pictures of stuff that looks exactly like this. So I'm curious, whoever did the cover design, am I reading into that right? So before I got cut off, I was talking about, but where Garth Nix really shines is in his world building, in his magic, the monsters he creates, and that's, so anyway, so that was, getting over the initial frustration of not having the world as well developed as I personally really wanted. I still had a really good time, and I'm definitely going to be keeping this for now and rereading through the rest of the series. I think the whole series has 6 books. So the next book I picked up was an ebook from my library. I picked up Atomic Habits by James Clear. So I do think this book has a lot of great strategies for understanding and implementing new habits and how to like deter bad habits. And format-wise, I appreciate that the end of each chapter has a concise summary of all of the main points of this book. This book is really geared toward being a reference book that you keep and you refer back to. So if you've been curious about, you know, is this actually good for figuring out how to implement new habits or break bad habits, I do think it has a lot of value with that. Now hold on to your butts, because I got a rant coming. So this book has a lot of fat phobia in it. And as frustrating and angry as like that is by itself, I think I'm almost more angry at the fact that I have seen maybe like a dozen in-depth reviews from watching various YouTubers and looking at Instagram. I've seen quite a few people, quite a few reviewers I trust talk about this book, reference it years after they've read it, and I cannot remember anyone acknowledging the fat phobia. So the most consistent way that the fat phobia is presented in this book is the idea of losing weight. It makes sense that it's mentioned in this book because it is a thing that a lot of people want to do, try to do. Yes, it is a common thing that people try to do and people struggle with, so it makes sense that it would be mentioned in this book. That's not my problem. My problem is that it felt like, I didn't actually track this. If I reread it, I probably would. But it felt like every single time the author was listing examples of a habit that a person would want to do, losing weight was example number 1 or 2. It felt like subliminal messaging of, you should lose weight. You should want to lose weight. Why aren't you trying to lose weight? It's not that hard. You should try to lose weight. It was really frustrating. And if that were all of it, if it was just a common example, okay. But then here's a couple of like the really heinous quotes that I found. An early quote was, "I have a friend who lost over 100 pounds by asking herself, what would a healthy person do?" This might actually be the tactic that his friend did, and it worked for them, but without context, it implies that fat people can't be healthy, which is not true. There are people who eat perfectly healthy, balanced meals every day of their life, and they're still fat. And there are people who exercise regularly. They can run marathons, they can climb mountains, and guess what? They're still fat. That was one. Then there is this awful thing. Shaming obese people with weight loss presentations can make them feel stressed, and as a result, many people return to their favorite coping strategy, overeating. And he doesn't back up that statement with any kind of statistical data or anything. Oh. I find it really frustrating because this author talks about how he's done all of this research, and he's done all of this research across various scientific and psychological disciplines, and yet he still has these very stereotypical opinions about fat people and their behavior and what makes them fat. And these are things that have been scientifically disproven. There is a correlation with fatness and health, but like a fat person can be healthy, a skinny person can be unhealthy. A fat person's favorite coping mechanism is overeating really promotes a lot of the reasons why people with fat bodies are treated with disrespect, because it's treated as a choice when in many circumstances it is not. I'm just disappointed in all of the reviewers I watched who didn't catch on to it or didn't think to mention it. Anyway, I think I gave this thing like a 3-star. I don't necessarily give star ratings to everything I read, but I felt like this one was like, for its purpose, it is really informative for giving habits, but you've heard my rant. You know my issues with it. Book number 7 was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I borrowed this from my library. I mostly listened to it on audiobook. I also picked up the ebook when it became available. I think actually I prefer the audiobook. There was something in the writing style that was like a very organic train of thought narrative. It wasn't very gentle on my easily distracted brain. I'm not saying that there's anything bad about it. I'm just saying I had to make a point of being really focused on the story, and I think being able to listen to it helped. Being able to listen and read it at the same time helped, just because the narrative style, there was something about it that invited my mind to wander, and that's my issue. It is not. I think there's something about, I am not an Own Voices reviewer for this Indigenous horror novel, but I think there's something about traditional storytelling styles of American Indigenous people that is an influence in this writing, and I think I've seen it in other books, and it's just different. than the story structures that I'm used to. So it's on me to do a little bit to find what can I do to make this story mesh with my brain better. Anyway, but overall, like the mood of this book was exquisite. The way that it built tension through the various perspectives, the way that like it makes you question your like either the protagonist or like your own sanity. Is this real? Did this thing actually happen the way that it was told to you, or was it something completely different? And was the narrator having a mental breakdown? Like this doubt and this questioning of sanity in that was like this really, really delicious tension. And also like the knowledge that it was going to get worse before it got better. This is definitely like I'm very picky with my horror. I'm not someone who reads a lot of horror, but something that is very mood-based and very, like, psychologically based. I mean, there is some, like, gory horror stuff in here, particularly to the end, but I felt like the build-up to it made those scenes feel like it wasn't just a shocking spectacle. It was like everything had a lot of like impact and meaning and history behind it. So yeah, this was good. I liked it. Book number 8 is this tiny little novella called Morning Girl by Michael Dorris. This is a fictional telling of first contact. It's a middle grade novella that imagines life of an indigenous Caribbean family in the days before first contact with Columbus. And it's inspired by a letter that Columbus wrote documenting his initial impressions of the first people, and there's a copy of the letter at the very end of the book. And the imagining it's like a dignified direct counter to the European assumptions of wealth and faith, civilization, trust, body shame. I almost kind of want that letter to be at the beginning of the book, so like you read Columbus's impression of these people, and then you see this retelling of how his perspective is so biased. Because he just doesn't really understand what's going on. Anyway, but like this was a delightful little gem. I think I read this in like half an hour right before going to bed, because it's a tiny little thing. So the story follows Morning Girl. She's like 11, I think. Either she's 11 and her brother's 9, or she's 9 and her brother is 7. So it follows Morning Girl and her younger brother Starboy. Some chapters, the events kind of like run together, and some chapters seem like individual standalone stories. It's beautifully written. It's a really interesting, lush exploration of the imagination of these children, their strong family bond, the way that their community comes together and supports each other. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more about the civilization and community as a whole. It was very, very focused just on like the family unit, but it is quite possible that because these are the first people to come in contact with Columbus, it could be that that information has been lost because those people have pretty much been wiped out. At least culturally, they've been wiped out. So I'm sure there's a lot of creative license that went into the story, but yeah, it was beautiful. We're halfway through it. Let's go. Book number 9 was Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I borrowed this from my library. My first memory of it is, holy shit, what a tome. I usually read books that are like between 300 and 400 pages. So, I mean, it was an ebook, so I shouldn't have really cared about how long it was. It's not like I was holding something heavy, but I feel like after like day 5 or 6, I'm like, how am I not done with this thing yet? Oh yeah, it's like 800 pages long. Fuck. But anyway, overall, I did like it. The magic system really reminded me of Foundry Side, or actually I should say that Foundry Side has clear influence from the physics-driven magic of Mistborn. I thought the magic was really interesting. I felt like there was a good amount of exposition and world building while still leaving plenty to explore in future books. I definitely came away with questions about like, wait, tell me more about that. What's going to happen here? But knowing that it's a complete series, I know that there's plenty of room to explore this world. I think this is a pretty common critique, but I'm pretty disappointed in the character of Vin. I wanted to like her, but she was really inconsistent. Like, sometimes she's like this really jaded kind of street rat character, but then sometimes she's like really kind of ignorant and naive. Sometimes she's really determined, and sometimes she's really decisive and doesn't really know what she should be doing. She's very powerful, but she's also really self-doubting, and it was just like, I mean, it just felt like there was like two different characters that she flipped between depending on what was convenient for the plot line at that time. There are some very apparent Christ parallels, the story of Christ parallels. What is it called? Christ figure parallels, which is basically when there is a character that in a book that very much mirrors the story arc of Jesus Christ. We see it a lot in books like in the Chronicles of Narnia with Aslan. We see it in Lord of the Rings, but J.R.R. Tolkien hated when there was only one Christ figure, so we see that story in various figures in Lord of the Rings. So there's a line in here that I think really hammers it home in case you didn't pick up on it. So this is someone kind of explaining to the group towards the end of the book. You were part of this plan too, the Kandra said. All of you. You were asked why he needed a crew. He needed men of virtue, men who could learn to worry more for the people than for coin. He put you before armies and crowds, letting you practice leadership. He was using you, but he was also training you. So that's basically the story of the apostles. So, anyway, so I bring this up because I saw someone mention how the author is Mormon, and they had various thoughts about that, which usually I don't really care. Like, knowing that someone is of some religious denomination or something is not, I don't usually care too much, but unless like it causes them to promote things that are false or harmful, but that's often not the case. So it was just interesting to know that. But then knowing that, it made, you know, the Christ figure parallels really apparent once I clued in on them. Book number 10, The Initiation by Nikki Sloane. I picked this up based on a review from the BookishRealm. I will link her Goodreads review of this below. Just because I read that review, I'm like, oh, this sounds like something that I might like in my adult romance books. And now I know that apparently the genre I like is dark romance. Cool. Now I know there's a name for it. So this is a dark erotic romance. It's a really interesting take on dominant power play in a scenario that's not an explicit BDSM relationship. But our female lead still has a really strong sense of agency and choice in a scenario where we play with the fantasy of choice being removed. So I think the author did a really good job of presenting a scenario that could come across as sexual assault, but putting enough things in there where it's like, no, she did have a choice. And it wasn't just you had a choice, but she felt duress to keep doing it. It was like, no, there was a very clear reinforcement that she could walk away from this and be okay. Like the element of duress was addressed as well. And like, yes, walking away would mean some things would be very difficult, but like, it's not that like her family was going to be murdered if she didn't do this thing. So yeah, I thought the author did a really good job of playing with that fantasy in a way that indulged the fantasy, but still left me feeling safe as a reader. So this book is a really indulgent portrayal of the lives of the extremely wealthy, and it does that in a way that doesn't make wealthy seem attractive. In a way, like, it addresses that, like, sometimes living in a very wealthy society, moving in very wealthy circles, it can sometimes breed poor money management and coping mechanisms, and also it addresses that objects don't replace personal relationships and happiness. And it's interesting looking at this family where they're kind of raised to not view happiness as a goal. They're just viewed to want to be successful, and happiness is not part of that formula. So, interesting. I liked it. I would like to continue with the series. My library doesn't have this. The first book is free on Kobo. Number 10 was Oversea Under Stone by Susan Cooper. This is the first book in the Dark is Rising series. This was another one that was on my reread to declutter list because I knew I'd read it, couldn't remember anything about it. This was super charming. It has a very like classical youth fantasy vibe, a la Chronicles of Narnia. The children are young and innocent and impulsive, but also like very pure of heart and creative and determined. The children actually read like children, which is nice. Sometimes you'll read a book and you're like, they say you're 12, but you're at least acting like you're 16. Or they say you're 16, but you are acting like a 25-year-old. So this plays on the legend of King Arthur, but it's not necessarily a King Arthur retelling. There's some outdated language. It was published in 1965. There's some outdated language when the children are playing at being explorers and they talk about the natives. Just putting that out there. I thought that this book had a really elegant take on the power of legend and fairy tales. There's an interesting idea of once upon a time being a phrase we use to describe a time that was once real, but it's been so long that nobody can remember exactly when. And I think there's also a really thoughtful portrayal of forces of good and evil, especially for a children's book. There was a line in here about it was as if they were fighting not people, but a dark force that uses people as its tools, which I think is a really interesting way to look at good and evil. That, like, if you focus too much on, like, the individual being the monster, then you ignore what made them so and what will make others in the future. So, this was I enjoyed this. I'm definitely going to continue with the series, but I'm not really going to rush through it. So book number 12 is The Story of Stuff by Annie Leonard. This was an audiobook from my library that talks a lot about the environmental impact of our stuff. And so this was narrated by the author, and at times I was kind of annoyed by like her very cutesy tone. Sometimes she'll be like talking about like chemicals in the water and be like, and who wants chemicals like that in your water? Yuck. Let's see. But as the book went on and I started to get like more and more depressed about just how awful humans can be to the planet and how awful first world countries are, the cutesy tone actually kind of became like a little life preserver of like, please tell me it's not all that bad. So anyway, so this book talks about a mix of like current harms, current remedies, or like improvements, like how far we have come. She talks about like scientific and economic impact on the environment and on humans. I picked up a little bit on a bit of a white saviorism tone. I don't think it was intentional. I mean, it's never really intentional. I don't think it's... Anyway, but I think you can definitely see cultural bias at work with the author. At one point, she's giving a very idyllic description of her local market as European, as if that's the only place that has community market hubs. It's not. I wish... Like, she talked a lot about poor communities, impacted communities that she had met and talked to when she was working and traveling. And it's good that she talks about, the individuals that she met. But I felt like that felt very, oh, look at how much the poor people are suffering. And it would have been better balanced if she had talked more about the local community members and organizations who are doing the work themselves and not waiting for the white people to come save them, because they exist and they need to be uplifted because they are going to know what is actually best for the people on the ground and how to best navigate their own circumstances in their own governments. Yes, while our wealthy companies and people who are able to donate, like, I'm not saying places like, I don't know, the Red Cross and Hunger International shouldn't exist, but I think we have a responsibility to draw attention to the people from those communities who are doing the work. Because, it's great to have a group come in and help you build a bunch of water pipes or build homes or whatever, but then they all leave. So what investment do they actually have in these communities? So anyway, that was just something I kind of noticed in the book, and I'm thinking about through my modern lens and with my own information. And I think this might, again, I don't think this is a deliberate oversight. I think it's just she is a product of the narratives that she and we have been told our whole lives living in first world countries, assuming that you are my listeners, watchers from there. Anyway. I did like her interesting take on thinking about our stuff and where it comes from. The argument of companies like Nike or Apple, they don't make stuff, they make brands. Factories make stuff. Sometimes the factories are making the same stuff for various brands and just slapping a different logo on it. And the most important thing that these brands do is market the product. One of my favorite takeaways was the idea of the way that we assign carbon footprint and environmental impact and how it's usually assigned to the country where it's happening. Even if the manufacturer who is committing these human rights or environmental violations is not based in that country, it's based in another country. So it's why isn't the carbon footprint assigned to the home base of the company? Why do we talk about China's poor air quality when it's European and American consumerism that's driving the demand for the factories over there? Anyway, that was an interesting thing to think about, the way that countries with means and with tight carbon emission limits can outsource the harm that they're doing. I think this is an interesting book. I think it does. I agree with some of the reviews that say it kind of struggles with tone. It'll explain some really, really basic stuff, but then it'll talk about some complex chemistry stuff that's going on. I feel like this is a book that you would read in a classroom and it would have something to appeal to a wide variety of authors and would have a lot of different points to jump off teaching other things in the classroom. It's not necessarily as much of a must-read now with other things that have come out as it used to be. The next book I read, number 13, was Winter Counts by David Heska, Wanbli, Weiden. So this one is a hard-hitting vigilante crime thriller written by an Indigenous author. At times it was a bit uncomfortable to read because it is relentless in portraying the injustices that are still perpetrated on Native Americans. I kind of expected that going in, but even then I was still oh man. Wow, we still continue to fuck them over. Fuck. And while it is fiction in the author's note, the author states that the events are all drawn from well-known and at times well-documented occurrences. It forces an outside reader to confront things like, does free healthcare count when it is knowingly subpar? This is something that was also brought up in Only Good Indians, of like the trend of doctors on reservations being inexperienced, unskilled, or otherwise unqualified for medical work elsewhere. A big thing about that motivates the main character to be a vigilante is the fact that tribes in the United States, they don't have the authority to prosecute federal crimes. But then when they refer to the crimes to the proper federal authorities, the authorities don't pursue them. So no wonder there are so many missing and murdered Indigenous women, children, and Two-Spirit, because, like, if someone's just missing, they're not going to bother looking for them. But then, like, the tribes themselves don't have the authority to dispatch police or investigators to look for them. About halfway through the book, I went back and I reread the review from Danny from ThunderBirdWomanReads. I will link that review in the description box as well. And she mentioned that at times this book is humorous, which at the time I was like, oh, what now? And then, like, I thought about it. And once it was pointed out to me, I did kind of pick up on, like, an absurd sarcasm at times. There's, like, a scene that's got, like, a Portlandia skit kind of absurdity of pretentiousness happening in an upscale coffee shop. And also, like, the well-intentioned self-righteousness of Lack and his indigenous food movement, where sometimes I'm like, I know you mean well, but your expectations are unreasonable. But if I think about it, like, okay, but is that on purpose so that it's kind of funny? Like, yeah, okay, I can see that. And I think I also pick up on some humor in the creative activism choices and the big dreams of the character of Tommy. So, yeah. Anyway, I liked this. It made me think a lot. At times it's not easy to read, especially because you know that, like, nothing is going to go smoothly for these characters. And you're just kind of, like, biting your fingernails hoping that things can turn out okay. But, yeah. The hype is real. I enjoy it. We're almost done. Okay. So, the next book was a DNF, and that is this hunking book. 5 novels by Daniel Pinkwater. I read most of the first one and most of the second one. So this was written in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's very much like preteen, teenage boy humor. That just, I'm just like one too much removed from the target audience to really be able to appreciate it. Also, there's like some well-meaning but outdated fat representation. I can see how, for the time it was written, it was taking the stereotypes of fat people and just embracing them and saying, hey, if you're gonna say that we eat a lot of junk food and like what we eat is gross, fine. I'm gonna make, space pirates that are cool. I'm gonna make that be the treasure that they seek, and it's gonna be a competition, and I'm just going to embrace it. And if it's something that's like fun and funny and like the center of the story, then you can't make fun of it because I did it first. So I see it, I appreciate it. Not my style. The next book I picked up was my favorite book that I read all month. Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. I read this book in a day. I didn't mean to. I did not mean to. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't stand to be away from the world. I needed to know what was going to happen. I needed to know that things were going to be okay. At times, the story feels absolutely devastating. It is worth it. The hype is real. It's a beautiful story. If you've heard of this book, you already know that the trans rep is amazing. Some of like my favorite moments are of Yadriel coming to terms with not being obligated to forgive those who have hurt him, even when the hurt is an accident. He's totally entitled to stick to his boundaries until the offending party gets it right. I also really like the conversation where Julian, maybe it's pronounced Julian, he questions Yadriel about what exactly he's trying to prove and to whom. It's like, what, are you trying to prove that you're a boy? Are you trying to prove that you're a brujo? Like, really, what is this about? Like, not doubting you, but you don't see, but anyway, it's some nice little comforting guidance. And also he reminds Yadriel that, no, there's no way that you're the first trans brujo. Like, trans people have existed throughout all of human history, or have existed as long as gender has been a category. So you might be the only one that you know, but you are not the first. So take comfort in that knowledge. And this is another YA book where I feel like the teen characters actually act their age. Their impulses and temper and desires are fitting, and the romance feels age appropriate. There's a lot of like yearning and nervousness and comfort, and it's like not overly sexualized. It's just really, really sweet, and it shows like what is good about a romantic, intimate relationship. That is, you can get something out of that is different from just your average family and friendships. So it's beautiful. I love it. I want to read everything Aiden Thomas writes. Ta-da! Okay, last book. Can I do this? Yes, I have 7 minutes. Great. All right, and the last book that I read was an ebook from my library. This is Not Until You by Loren. This is the 4th book in her Loving on the Edge series. It's a compilation of 8 parts. There's definitely some 50 Shades of Grey parallels. 50 Shades is published in 2011. This one was published in 2014. New college grad innocent girl Celia gets involved with dominant, controlling, wealthy business entrepreneur Foster. Sella, did I say Celia? Her name is Marcella. So because she's kind of innocent, she has to do research on a lifestyle that is completely new to her. Foster has a tragic backstory that influences his controlling nature. And at times, Foster's need to control Sella gets in the way of their relationship. So, definitely, if you've read 50 Shades, those are some very, very clear parallels. I think this one's better. It's not my favorite in the Loving on the Edge series. I think, like, the distinct 8-part segments, it kind of screws with the pacing a little bit. But anyway, a big difference, though, a big difference between this one and 50 Shades is that when Foster starts to stalk Sella a little bit, there's actually some consequences. The police get called on him. Everything turns out fine, but at least, even though his stalking is not harmful, there's at least the acknowledgement of, doesn't matter your motivations, it's creepy, don't fucking do it. Sella and her family are Latina. There's some notable instances of her accent being described as spice-laden, or her temperament being described as fiery. It's not anything like too heinously racially insensitive. I think it's just kind of like a lack of imagination. It's not great, but it's not the worst. Like I was saying with the pacing, I think like the 8-part segments, it threw off the pacing. It made it too long. But still, like all of Loren's books, there are great themes of the emphasis of communication and honesty, and challenging the expectations of shame around sex and embracing your sexual interests. Steamy scenes are still the best part, you know. I mean, we know. We go, if you read these books, you go there for the steaminess. But I gotta gush about this series because everything else around it is very well crafted. So, that was a nice way to end the month. Okay. Anyway, thank you for listening to this whole thing. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have all of the books listed in the description box. I will have my other social media places in there if you would like to connect with me elsewhere. I will catch you folks in my next video. Bye!